Hi everyone. So today my talk is going to focus on the implication of increased luxury high-value seafood consumption in China and what this means for coastal livelihoods in the Coral Triangle. So I'll focus mostly on the live reef fish for food trade, which is an example of a luxury seafood that gets supplied mostly from Southeast Asian countries and on coastal livelihoods in the Philippines, which is a major supplier of live fish. So today I'll give more of a broad overview of some of the many different issues that are involved, and I'll draw on my work on this trade over the last few years. So I'll firstly very briefly just go through some of the factors behind Chinese consumption of luxury seafood. I'll then give a bit of background about the live reef fish for food trade generally. I'll then discuss some of the research that I've done in Palawan province in the Philippines that's looked at this trade, and then I'll look at what some of the environmental and social implications of the trade are. So firstly, when I talk about luxury seafoods, I'm talking about very expensive foods that are usually consumed in large banquets. So live reef fish, bêche de mer and shark fin, for example, are three different types of this. And the consumption of much of this seafood has been quite popular for many hundreds of years. And bêche de mer and shark fin, for example, were eaten partly because they were seen as strengthening or tonic foods that boosted general health. Mostly though, the consumption of much of this seafood was dominated in southern China and around Hong Kong, and it's only been actually relatively recently, since the 1980s and the 1990s, that this sort of luxury seafood consumption has really taken off throughout mainland China. And nowadays a lot of this consumption is much more to do with conspicuous consumption and asserting social status. So much of this seafood gets eaten at very large, expensive banquets. And eating a really expensive reef fish like this coral trout here gets you a lot of status as a host. So a lot of the more expensive reef fish can sell for well over $100 a kilo, and so the coral trout here is being sold for about $35 for a 150 gram portion there. So Hong Kong, partly because of its status as a free port, it's got much lower taxes than the mainland, so it remains a really important part of the trade for much of this luxury seafood. And a great deal of the luxury seafood still does get eaten around Hong Kong. But nowadays, much more so than in the past, Hong Kong acts as a real trade hub instead, and so a lot of the product ends up getting funneled through Hong Kong and then re-exported via places like Shenzhen, which is a big city on the border with Hong Kong, and from there it goes to the rest of the mainland. There's only really limited accurate data on how much exactly is being traded, but the trend seems very much for a high proportion of consumption of these luxury seafoods coming from the Chinese mainland, and this is expected to increase as the Chinese economy continues to grow and disposable incomes increase. And this, as I'll get into, has obvious implications for the source countries such as those in Southeast Asia. So just as a very quick introduction to the live reef fish for food trade, again the data is very patchy, but current estimates are of about 30,000 tonnes per year being traded, worth about $2 billion US. And at least 60% of this goes to China and Hong Kong, but the real figures are most likely higher. So the major species caught for the trade are the coral trout, in particular Plectrophomus leopardus, but also other Plectrophomus species. There's Barramundi Cod, which is one of the more highly priced species in the trade. Napoleon wrasse, which is probably the most highly priced species in the entire trade. And a whole range of Epinephelus species as well, which are generally a fair bit more lower valued. So you can see on the simple diagram there, the trade is what often gets called a commodity chain and goes through many different people before it finally gets to the consumer. So you'll have a fisherman who will then catch the fish and sell it to either to a middleman or direct to a local trader, and often at this stage they'll grow the fish out first if it isn't at a suitable size yet. From the local traders, the fish get transported to an exporter, usually based in the larger cities around Southeast Asia, the ones that have international airports. And then it goes to an importer, usually in Hong Kong, who often sells it to further importers based in mainland China, who then distribute it around the country to restaurants and hotels who serve the fish at banquets. And at each stage of the chain, obviously, the price rises so that each player in the chain is able to make a profit. So this slide shows the major trade routes of the live fish trade. Again, the data is quite patchy and contradictory. But basically the major exporters that together comprise virtually all of the supply, the Philippines and Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia and Thailand. There is sporadic trading in other places such as in parts of the Pacific, but basically the big exporting countries are those ones that I've just mentioned. There's many issues that have been well documented though with the live fish trade. And firstly, it's the simple problem of overfishing. So the fish that are targeted by the trade are generally fairly long-lived and slow to reproduce, which means that they're quite vulnerable to fishing pressure. And so you can see this especially with the Napoleon wrasse, which has been shown to decline very rapidly, basically wherever it's been fished. There's a few specific practices of the trade that are part of the overfishing issue. So fishermen often target spawning aggregations, which obviously has an impact on fish populations. But the trade is probably most notorious for the use of sodium cyanide to catch the fish. So a tablet of cyanide is dissolved in a water bottle, which is then squirted by a diver onto the coral, which stuns the fish, which are then scooped up and revived once they're back on the surface. And so this is a much more efficient method than hook and line, and so it's obviously a large contributor to fishing pressure, but it also obviously has effects on the corals as well. Another important aspect of the Chinese consumption of these fish is that they're preferred as plate-sized fish, so this means that smaller fish are actually actively targeted, and so especially for the larger reef fish like Napoleon wrasse, it means that the fish that get caught are usually quite young and relatively immature. There's juvenile fish that are also caught, where they're placed in grow-out cages until they reach a marketable size, like this fish in the slide here. There's also health issues, such as decompression sickness, which is reasonably common among many of the divers. So fishers have to be careful as well when they fish not to accidentally stab themselves with the needles that they use to puncture the swim bladders of the fish, and they often use disposed needles that they get from health clinics. So you can see in the picture there the whole container of used bloody needles, which are actually being sold at the local general store next to the biscuits and the eggs where I work. There's also been issues raised about the economic distribution of benefits of the trade, and some people have argued that the trade is structured and skewed in a way that it benefits the larger traders and doesn't financially benefit the smaller fishermen as much. But this isn't a simple issue though, and while the trade often gets demonised by many environmentalists, it's a massively important livelihood for many people in coastal parts of Southeast Asia, and that's probably the point I want to highlight with my own research. So Palawan in the Philippines is where I've done most of my research on the live fish trade. You can see it's the long, narrow island in the western Philippines. I'm an anthropologist, so I do social research mostly, working with fishing communities and traders, and I've looked at things like responses to regulations among fisherfolk, and especially how the cultural context of the Philippines affects these responses, and also the relationship between fishing and livelihood more generally for coastal households in the Philippines. So I did my PhD research in Coron in 2006, the northern end of Palawan, so this included living for a year with a fishing family there, but more recently I've been working at the southern end of the province instead. And I spent a couple of months there earlier this year, and this was part of a collaborative project with Michael Pito and some others at Palawan State University, looking at trading networks. And I'm also looking at the consumption issues in China in more detail, so I'll be doing several months of fieldwork there next year. So Palawan's estimated to supply at least half of the live fish that come out of the Philippines, so it's a really important centre of the entire trade. So it's generally referred to as the last frontier of the Philippines. There's very high levels of biodiversity, and there's a whole bunch of marine and terrestrial conservation organisations that are working there at the moment. The trade began in Palawan in the late 1980s, but it really only developed and boomed during the 1990s and the 2000s as the price and the demand rose. And so for a good quality, good sized coral trout now, fishermen in some parts of the province can get well over $50 a kilo, and this can sometimes rise to well over $60 or $70 a kilo around the peak season, which is just before Chinese New Year. So compared with other similar small-scale fisheries, the potential profits are quite large and are obviously the primary factor why people have gotten involved in the trade. And if you go to pretty much any coastal region in Palawan, you'll find most communities have a significant proportion of fishermen involved in the trade. And that's one of the main things I'm describing in my research, is what I call a process of intensification. So you're getting more and more people involved in the trade and expending greater amounts of time and money on the trade, and this is all driven by increasing demand from China. So a lot of the environmental trends in Palawan include those that I've described for the trade earlier, and although there are actually a lot of fishermen who still fish with just hook and line, there is still quite a lot of sodium cyanide that gets used to catch the fish. So the photo here shows the squirter that gets used to catch the fish, and also the tablets of cyanide, and also the air compressor and the hose there that gets used for the diving. So there isn't a great deal of really rigorous stock assessments in the area, although there have been some assessments of coral cover in the region that show quite a fair bit of degradation. And it's been estimated by the provincial government environmental agencies using these basic assessments of coral cover that Palawan's considerably overfishing what's considered sustainable for coral trout. Talking to fishermen though, you get a very good idea of what the catch trends are, and the perceptions of fishermen are generally that you have to fish for further distances and for longer periods of time than previously, and that the average size of the fish themselves is declining. These are very blunt instruments, but they do give some idea of what is likely going on. And although overall export levels from Palawan have continued to increase, specific centres of the trade have moved around to different areas around Palawan and the Philippines in a real boom and bust sort of fashion. So the experience of Coron, for example, is quite illustrative. Coron was the real pioneer of the trade and the largest supplier of live fish for many years. But as you can see on the graph, in recent years, the supplies dropped really significantly over the last few years, and many of the traders have now moved on to other locations of Palawan and the Philippines. So these are all sort of general indicators of overfishing. Talking to fishermen though, of course the environmental issues are not the most important, or even particularly important when you compare them to issues such as healthcare and economic development. So the table here shows a ranking of community level problems and issues that were identified in our fieldwork in southern Palawan, and how concerns about fisheries declines are much lower than these other livelihood concerns. So this basically shows that concerns about healthcare and a lack of or limited livelihood opportunities were nominated far and away as the most significant problem facing people in the area, and that fisheries issues ranked much lower down the list behind other issues such as water quality, a lack of electricity, food security and educational opportunities. And so when you complement that sort of survey method with detailed qualitative interviews, it becomes pretty clear what the immediate issues facing local people are. So I guess that goes to the heart of the issue, that the trade in live reef fish is often operating in a context of extreme underdevelopment. So in much of the region there's very limited opportunities for good alternative livelihoods, and in many islands, for example, there's limited or no agricultural possibilities. So from this perspective, the trade in live fish has been a massively important economic stimulus to local communities. So relative to where they were previously, many households have been able to improve their standard of living from subsistence level only to be able to make basic investments in things such as a basic education for their children and some level of healthcare and material goods that have resulted in an improved standard of living. So while the trade often gets a really bad reputation, especially because of its significant environmental impacts, it is massively important for local communities in the context where there aren't many other pathways to a reasonable quality of life, and so there's no real simple governance solutions. So one of the key issues then is that if you look at things from the perspective of the ecological scale or the provincial scale or the national scale, it seems to clearly make sense to implement governance reforms that's going to cut down on the amount of fishing being done. But then if you look at things from a household perspective, it might actually make more economic sense to overfish and then to migrate to another location or to switch to another form of fishing. So even if people recognise fisheries declines in the trade in the long term, they need incentives to be able to switch out of these relatively more profitable fisheries in the short term. And these are some of the disconnects that policymakers have to deal with. So finally, to briefly go over some of the policy and governance issues raised by the trade, which could be the topic of many talks on their own. So at a broad level, there's issues to do with conflicting policies. So for example, in the Philippines, the Fisheries Code of 1998 actually specifically bans the trade in live reef fish. And this code is generally more oriented towards resource conservation. On the other hand, the Agricultural and Fisheries Modernisation Act of 1997 instead promotes maximum harvesting and the development of export markets. So, and then at the provincial level in Palawan, there's a lot of debate and turf wars between different agencies over whether or not provincial agencies are actually allowed to make laws that are going to affect the fishery at a provincial level, or whether it's just the decentralised municipal governments that are allowed to do so. Despite the lack of clarity with policies, for many years now local governments in the Philippines have grappled with how to regulate the trade in a more sustainable way. And so the problems are well recognised by many groups in the governments, and they've led the way for many of the source countries in Southeast Asia in introducing innovative regulations and laws to govern the trade. But basically there's just a massive gap in terms of policy and practice. So you're getting a situation where many laws and regulations are being produced, there's very little actual implementation and enforcement. And this is due partly to weak governance capacity, but also largely to the difficulty of implementing regulations that restrict fishing activity in a context where fishing activities are in many cases the only viable livelihood in the short term. So as much as policymakers at broader scales, such as the provincial or the national governments, might want to implement governance reforms, if you don't have the support of local households, things are simply unlikely to get done. So poor people will find a way to keep making profits regardless of what the technical laws might actually say. And even when strict implementation of some fisheries laws has taken place, because of the poverty context, it means that fishers often turn to other destructive techniques, like dynamite fishing, for example, or to selling the fish that might be caught otherwise as live fish, as fresh or dead fish. And they also command a relatively high price. So the emphasis, I think, really needs to be looking at things much less in terms of win-win solutions, and much more in terms of trade-offs and how to address different interests much more explicitly. And one of the core interests in the fisheries here is obviously the livelihoods of fishing households. And I think we just need to be a bit more explicit and honest about the fact that strict regulation of fisheries like these will have an impact on a large number of fishermen, and are therefore unlikely to have a great deal of local legitimacy, and are therefore unlikely to work in these particular situations. So we need to think about, for example, addressing the broader drivers that affect the vulnerabilities of fisherfolk as well. So this might mean addressing some of the things that lie outside the fishery sector, but are actually key to the potential success of fisheries governance. And I think these need to be included as a part of any fishery governance program. And there's a lot of development studies, people who've been writing on this issue as well. On a broader level, looking at the trade generally, policymakers such as NGOs involved with the Coral Triangle initiative, they've also been looking at trying to get major traders to sign up to a code of practice for the trade, and they've also been trying to begin to engage the Chinese government and Chinese business associations by talking to them and bringing them to technical workshops. There's also been efforts at consumer marketing campaigns targeting Chinese consumers, although that's more to do with shark fin and less so with live reef fish. Aquaculture of certain species is also taking off, although there's limitations with many of the high-priced species of reef fish. And as I mentioned earlier, these are some of the issues I'm looking at with my Chinese research. So just to sum up quickly, luxury seafood consumption in China has really been increasing over the last couple of decades, and this has driven the price of live reef fish right up, meaning that fishermen in coastal areas of source countries in the Philippines are becoming drawn to the trade, and that this trade has become more and more important for more groups of people. And this has been documented not just in the Philippines, but throughout Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia. And so while the effects of this trade are in many ways pretty devastating to the marine environment, the trade remains extremely important for those who actually live with this marine environment in the source countries, and so the ways forward are likely to involve a great deal of hard choices, I think, about both coral reefs and the livelihoods of the people of Southeast Asia. And I'll just finish with a few words of thanks to the organisations that support me.